concluded chapter 32. Oh, there we go. We'll start with the blessing actually. Let's do a bracha if you have a juice or a coffee, and we'll make a blessing or water. It goes like this. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam shakol niyah bidvaro.
Amen.
And actually interesting, if you're a righty, you actually hold the cup in your right hand when you make the blessing. If you're a lefty, then obviously you would do it in your left hand. And the main reason is the right is showing more respect. When you shake someone's hand, you give your right hand. If you're a righty, you give your stronger hand. Or if you're a lefty, you'll give your left hand. But generally, most people would give their right hand. And when we do a mitzvah, when we do a blessing, we also want to show our respect and priority that this is something we are looking forward to do. So we actually do it with our right hand. And most things in Judaism, we give priority to the right, which is interesting. The light symbolizes love and kindness. So even when we give charity, we give with our right hand to show our joy in the giving, our love in the giving, our generosity in the giving, even if it's not a big amount, but just as important as the amount is the attitude of how it's given. Whereas if you're giving with your left hand, it's showing a little less of a enjoyment in giving. So therefore we do most of the things with our right hand. It's just interesting to note that chapter 32, we spoke all about love, how to truly love someone else, that we don't look at the other person based on their body, based on their animal soul. We look at ourselves based on our godly soul, and then it's easier to see someone else based on their godly soul. And if you do that, you reach a place where we're all together. We're all like brothers. We're all sisters. We're all united. And it's not just coming together. We're actually all one in essence. And therefore, it's much easier to see the joy in someone else's success and to really hope for their success, because it's actually also part of your success. That was one of the beautiful features that we had in chapter 32. Continuing along that theme of love, we're actually going to be talking about our relationship with God now, going back to the basics of the Tanya, which is all about our relationship with God. Chapter 32 was pausing and saying, once you have that development in our relationship with God, just apply that to our relationship with our fellow person as well. So now we're just going back to that relationship with God and saying that we're deepening a joy that is felt in our relationship with God. And I'm going to actually be more honest to the text today, just to really taste, to see where the Tanya is going here. It's a beautiful theme that we are now going to develop. Chapter 33 is like the next category, where in the past, in chapter 26, we were talking about the importance of joy. And we said you should find the joy through the fulfillment of a mitzvah. And specifically in chapter 31, we gave the example of, think of a prince or a princess, if they are banished from their palace, and what they would give to hear the voice of their king again, of their father, to just be back in their palace. And every time we do a mitzvah, it's like that home feeling for the soul. Every time we do a connection with God, a mitzvah, it's allowing that soul to feel the voice of God again. So it brings such a joy to the soul. But now we're going to go even deeper, that the real joy of our soul with God, the real joy of a Jew with God, is actually not even dependent on the fulfillment of a mitzvah. It reaches much, much deeper. It's not dependent on a mitzvah. We'll see that inside, and then perhaps next week I'll give more of an outline, just so you see how we started and how that continues in the chapter. But just for now, I will just read, as I mentioned every now and then, just the summary of what chapter 33, which is the chapter up to now. It's the title over here in this map of the Tanya, which I see Robin also has, that's perfect. It's called Rejoicing in Your Divine Purpose. So it's a really fundamental chapter. Be happy for yourself, for you are privileged to take part in making this world a home, an abode for God. So that itself should bring you joy, that you're part of the cosmic plan. You have a mission here, and you're privileged to be part of that. So be happy for yourself, not even the dependency in a mitzvah. And therefore, also number 2 is be happy for God, as his desire for this abode is being fulfilled. So be happy for yourself that you are privileged to be part of it, and be happy for God that it's being fulfilled, what God wants. Okay, let's see chapter 33 inside. I'll be pulling it up on the screen. If you're looking in the book, it's going to be on 369 towards the bottom. The title, the way it is in our practical Tanya, is Feeling God, Feeling Joy. Section 1, Finding Joy in God's Closeness. Okay, let me share the screen. And I'm looking forward to getting into it. Here we go. Okay, awesome. I hope everyone could see the screen. Let me just switch to chapter 33 now. Here we go. Okay. Oh, there we go. Frida is joining as well. Perfect. Chapter 31 taught us two uplifting meditations to find comfort and joy, following the deeply humbling meditations of chapters 29 and 30. But in chapter 31, the insights are limited to joy that comes through mitzvah observance. So if you remember in chapter 31, we had the comfort. That was a beautiful word. That we feel the pity of the soul, that it's far from its palace, and you feel the joy when you bring it close again. And there was also in chapters 29 and 30, we had a little bit of a heavier meditation where it even led to the point of yelling at our animal soul, saying, enough already, leave me alone, let me fulfill my purpose. So, but here in chapter 33, we learn a further meditation to bring true joy. And that's going to be the wording of the Tanya, true joy, which is a joy that is not dependent on any activity, time, or place. It is a joy that flows from your essential being and the presence of God found in your soul, your body, and in everything. So this is going to be a much deeper level of joy. And just to explain that, I may have mentioned this before. It says that Elisha, who was one of the greatest prophets, his teacher and his predecessor, his name was Elijah, Eliyahu Hanavi. He's probably more famous, Elijah. He comes to our Seder every year. He comes to the bris. But his student and successor, whose name was Elisha, it says was able to do double the amount of miracles that his teacher did. So it says that by Elisha, whenever it came time for him to give a prophecy, he had someone play music. Because for him to prophesy, we needed to be in a state of joy. But for him to put himself in a state of joy, he needed music in the background. It just put him in a good place, which is a beautiful idea, especially for those that are have a musical ear and a musical soul. It's a beautiful thing to pay attention to. But over here, in chapter 33, we're going to try to reach a level of joy that is not dependent on a place we're in or something that's with us or someone that's with us. It's going to be a much deeper level of joy, and therefore it's called a true joy. Let's see what that is. Another method to find true joy in your soul, particularly when on those specific occasions, when your heart becomes desensitized, which we learned about in chapter 29, you see that it is in need of some cleansing. And it needs the light of a joyous heart. That's beautiful. Who doesn't need that joyous heart? So let's see how we get it. What could you do then is probe deeply in your mind, picturing mentally and cognitively the concept of God's genuine non-duality, which we discussed in chapters 20 and 21. The Tanya now briefly recaps the main themes of chapters 20 and 21. So instead of me bringing you back up to speed, we'll let the Tanya speak for itself. Sorry, more people coming in. Perfect. How he fills all worlds, upper and lower, and even how this lowly physical world is filled with his glory. And in his presence, everything is considered zero, literally, and all believe that he is one alone, which we quote in our high holiday prayers. In the upper and lower world, literally, just as he was alone before the 6 days of creation. So non-duality, let's just finish one more paragraph perhaps. And even in the space where our world was created, the skies, the earth, and all their numerous components, just as he was originally alone filling the space, now too, he is also alone without any change whatsoever, because the separate identity of all the creations is literally voided in his presence. So the main theme that we discussed in this message of non-duality was you can't say that God is in the higher worlds and he also hangs out and comes down here. That's a duality where there's an upper and lower place. God's presence is felt more in the upper worlds than here. And that's not that we can't say that. And therefore, the way we explained it, that the true non-duality is when we see that there's worlds from the upper worlds and lower worlds, but God's presence is felt equally in the higher worlds and lower worlds. There's no existence, there's no place in existence that is void of God's being. Everything in comparison to God and his infinite light is zero. Everywhere there's a godly light and God's presence is fully felt. We're going to give an analogy of that now based on our soul. The Tanya now recaps the illustration we learned earlier about the source of language in the soul. The separate identity of the creation, or of the creations, are literally voided in his presence, just like the component letters of speech and thought are voided in their pre-linguistic source, which is the deep core of the soul, namely the soul's 10 powers, Chachma, Bina, and Das, at which point letters have not yet crystallized. Since this is before expression that takes place in the garment of thought. As was explained at length in chapters 20 and 21, see there. So just to summarize this point, the message is a cool idea where when you come up with an idea and you form the right thought and that develops the speech in order to express it, that's already limiting the idea I had. It has to come out in a thought process, and then it comes out into the speech, how I'm going to express it. But there is the power of the soul that came up with that idea that cannot be defined or identified based on the language of how you're going to express it, or based on the thoughts of how you're going to think about it. There's the feeling of it that is pre-linguistic, is the word he's using in Tanya. It's the idea before it comes out in a shaped place in thought and speech. The place there is the soul powers. From what we said is the inquiry of it, the curiosity to know what it's about, the focus on it and analyzing the idea. And then what your feeling is about it. Do you want to continue this? Is it something that will enhance who you are? It's something that you're excited about? It's something that's going to bring you fear and anxiety? So that's a feeling that you have before it comes out into any words or language that can be expressed. So it doesn't yet have an identity that is describable. Similar to that, we're going to have we're translating that into the how God, there's identity of every world, spiritual world, what it is, where it is, and what that world is about. But prior to that, there is the way it is by God himself, where it's pre-linguistic, so to speak. It doesn't have the identity of this world versus that world, a higher light and a lower light. On this quote-unquote pre-linguistic place, God's light is infinite and equal everywhere it is. It's like the pre-linguistic stage, so to speak. In the second book of Tanya, which is Sha'ar HaYichud VeEmunah, another analogy is used to illustrate the non-dual idea. Briefly, the Tanya touches upon the second analogy here. So that was one analogy, and here comes the second one. Let's see. Actually, this one is quite a famous one. And I'm just going to read from Shira. What is considered the deep core of this kud? We have the levels of the soul, nefesh, ruach, neshama, chaya, and yechida. Wow. must have taken, oh, got it, soul, awesome. It's a lot of spelling there just for the 5 levels of the neshama. Good job, Shira. Nefesh, ruach, neshama, chaya, and yechida. So where does the deep core of the soul lie? Is it with Hashem and chaya or yechida? Great question. So it's a mixture of chaya and yechida. And actually, just to see the deep core, so different levels. The emotional part is the level of nefesh. The emotional part, the biology part, the physical health part is nefesh. The emotional part is ruach. The thought process part is neshama. And then going higher, chaya and chida is part of the deeper core. But yeah, that's a good question. So the first idea of explaining this pre-linguistic, the point was to explain how the infinite lights of God has a place where it's all equal, the higher worlds, the lower worlds, because it's pre the place of worlds being divided. Similar to in our soul, there's the linguistic place where we could express an idea and define or describe a thought that we have, the components of letter and speech. But then there's also the level before that. But let's see the other analogy. It's quite a famous one, and I think we could relate to this one also. And as is explained elsewhere in the next section of Tanya in chapter 3, a different physical example of how the separate identity of the sun's light and rays is voided inside its source. That source is the sun's physical globe seen in the sky. So you have the source of the light, which is the sun itself. And then you have the sun's light, the rays, that is around the sun and shines all the way to our world. But those rays are totally voided to the sun itself. For also there inside the sun, that light and those rays definitely shine forth, even more powerfully than they shine forth in this world's atmospheric space. But there in their source, despite their greater intensity, they're separate. I'm sorry, but there in their source, despite their greater intensity, their separate identity as individual rays of light is extinguished, and it's as if they simply don't exist. And that's a very precise analogy for how the separate identity of the world and its contents is voided in relation to its source, which is the blessed infinite light of God, as explained there in Sharichas B'Emunah at length. So just to summarize the second analogy, which I think is quite relatable, how the sunlight comes down into this world. But those sunlights, this rays of the sun, exists in the sun itself. The only difference is over here, we look at the sun rays and we see how strong it is and how warm it is and how bright it is, especially today and tomorrow in Marin, it's a heat wave that's hitting us. So those rays, do they exist in the sun itself? The answer is, of course they exist. They're even stronger than the way they are here, but they're totally voided. You don't look at the rays of the sun in the sun and say, wow, they're so strong, because you're in the sun. So the rays of the sun, the sunlight in the sun, is almost totally voided to the sun itself. Only over here, it seems like it's a separate identity, how the sun is shining forth and we have the rays of the sunlight coming here. Over here, it looks like a separate identity. So similar to that, the rays of the sun in the sun itself being totally voided, even though they exist, is similar to the idea of how by the infinite light of God, all worlds are totally united. They're all one. There isn't a separate entity between this world and a separate defined description of that world. In that place, in God himself, in the infinite light of God, the way it is above worlds, all of it is one. Everything in front of God is like voided. They're like a non-entity. They don't have their own identity. So we just summarized the message that is from earlier in Tanya, from chapters 20 and 21, the idea that God's infinite light is everywhere, and in the place of God's infinite light, everything of existence is totally nullified to the infinite light of God. That's the main idea we have so far. And now the Tanya is going to take that message that we just summarized from earlier and apply that to how it brings us joy. When we meditate on this idea that everything in front of God's infinite light is voided, is like nothing. It's almost, it doesn't have its own identity. It's totally included, contained in God's infinite light. Now we can take that message to how that's supposed to bring us joy. Now we're in the middle of the page on the Kindle, and 371 at the bottom in the book. When you will probe this non-dual idea extensively, and again, the non-dual idea means that God is not separate in the higher worlds than he is in the lower worlds, but it's a non-duality. It's all one. It's all part of God's existence and all nullified in front of God's infinite light. So if you probe this idea, your heart will gladden, I think it's supposed to be, will be gladdened or will gladdened, and your soul will rejoice even with joy and singing. And that's a quote from Isaiah. With all your heart, soul, and might, which is from the Shema, right? B'chol levavcha, b'chol nafshecha, b'chol meodecha. So that's a quote from Deuteronomy chapter 6, the Shema. In this faith, for it is great. And that's a quote from Esther. Since it is literally closeness to God. And this is, by the way, the next couple lines in Hebrew is one of the lines that the Rebbe chose as one of the most fundamental lines of the entire Torah. So we have the Rebbe in the early 80s, in the late 70s, 76, right around the miracle in Entebbe. The Rebbe scanned the entire Torah, both written law and oral, and he took 6 verses from the written law and 6 verses or quotes from the oral law to become the 12 foundational verses that every Jewish child should be familiar with. General themes in Torah. And my children are able to say them by heart. And actually in lineup, just at 9 o'clock, there's lineup for these campers, and they're learning these beautiful themes of Torah that were chosen by the Rebbe right before the miracle in Entebbe. So the miracle in Entebbe was in July, was it July or sorry, June, I think, right? June of 76. Does that sound right? Anyone remember? Was it, okay, either June or July of 76. And a month or two before then, the Rebbe introduced these 12 foundational verses. One of them being the Shema, of course. Another one being the Torah Tziva Lanu Moshe, Morasha Kilat Yaakov, which we've been discussing here, the idea of Morasha, that Judaism is a heritage of the Jewish people. Another one that was probably one of my favorites is if a quote from the Talmud where it says, if a person says, I've tried hard, but I haven't seen success, don't believe them. If a person says, I didn't even have to try, but I've seen success, don't believe them, because that's not real success. Real success is when they say, I tried hard and I see success, then you should believe them. It's a beautiful teaching for children all the way through, from infancy all the way through our older, ripened years. We should know that. So anyway, another one of these foundational verses is actually the next few lines of this chapter of Tanya. And here it goes. And this is the whole purpose of man and the reason for which he was created. And it's also the reason for the creation of all the worlds, upper and lower. What's the purpose of all of creation? To have this home for God in the lower worlds. And that's a quote from Medrash Tanchuma. A central theme of Hasidic thought, which will be explored in the coming chapters, so we're laying down the theme over here, is the Midrashic idea that God created the universe in order to have a dira b'tachtonim, which means a home in the lower physical worlds. That's why God created everything. He created everything so that he could feel at home, God's infinite light, which is the home part of God, God's essence. He could be most comfortable in this world. He wanted this world to be his home. Just like when you're in a hotel room, you don't feel the most comfortable. You're kind of in a place that's not yours. So you could be in the most lavish hotel, but you just can't wait to be home. You're looking forward to that feeling of kicking off your shoes, sitting on the couch, and just being back in your environment. That's when you feel the most comfortable. Similar to that, God says, I want my home to be in this lower world. And we are part of that purpose. We are part of that mission. God is trusting each and every one of us for God's home, which is where he feels the most at home. His essence shines. Where should that be? In this world. In Hebrew, it's called the Dira B'Tachtonim, which means a home for God in this lower world. A central theme of Hasidic thought, which will be explored in the coming chapters, is the Midrashic idea that God created the universe in order to have a Dira B'Tachtonim, home in this lower physical world. And here in chapter 33, a Dira B'Tachtonim is understood to mean thinking about God in a non-dual way. Whenever you are aware that the separate identity of all the creations is literally voided in his presence, then your consciousness becomes a home for God in the lower worlds. Aha, interesting. So if I'm understanding correctly, the way we're understanding a home for God is talking about in our conscience. The way we are thinking, that we have to think of God in a non-dual way, that it's not a separate identity of God upper and lower, that this entire world with all of the creations in it is voided in God's presence. If you have that mentality, if you have that mindset, then you're creating a home for God in this world. So really, for now, it's really your mindset. It's your meditation on realizing that everything in this world is non-dual. It's all part of God's existence. It's all part of God's infinity. Awesome. And I think later, that's what he's going to say in the next line. He's going to expand on that idea to be more cosmic. But now it's more just in our mindset. As the concept of Dir B'Tachtonim will be explained later on at length in chapters 36, 37, and 49. So it's going to be a central theme that's going to be spoken about in a couple of chapters. Even thinking about God's non-dual oneness makes your mind into a home for God. And that is an especially powerful source of joy because A, it affects your inner world, and B, it's available to you always, at any time, and in any place. So I love this idea where I just to linger on this a little bit, the idea that God's non-dual identity, God's non-dual being, it's created through us, through our mindsets. We could be in that mindset wherever we are. If you have that, you're a liberated person. You have that mentality that God is not separate from you. Everything in front of us is really part of God's creation. It's really a part of God's non-dual existence. So you could be living in, God forbid, a tormented place. And yes, things could be rough. Oh, great to see you, Ava. Thanks for joining. But at the same time, you could, in your mindset, it's always for you to have. No one could take that away for you ever. And that could bring you into a place of joy. I find it to be a very powerful idea. I'm just going to read a practical lesson that I see on 372 in the book, and then we'll continue on. A practical lesson goes like this. When you think about how everything is dissolved into God's presence, you will feel the joy of being very close to God. That everything is part of God's presence, you'll feel close to God. And there's a joy that comes from that experience, from that feeling. The Tanya in the middle of the Kindle page, towards the bottom of 372 in the book, the Tanya now examines why the Midrash uses the term home for God to express an intimate union and why this ought to be a source of joy. Now imagine the immense joy of an ordinary person, the most lowly of men, which is a quote from Daniel, if a human king were to come close to him by lodging and permanently living with him in his humble little house. So I have a little shack at the edge of town. And the king is coming not just to visit, but he wants this place to be his home. And I'm a nobody. And a king is coming to spend time with me. What does that do to you that brings you such an honor, such a joy? all the more so to an immeasurably greater extent should you be happy at the thought of God, the blessed King of Kings, making his intimate home with you. So God has his home that he says, I want it to be with you, in our mindset, in our meditations. We are allowing God in. We are making that home for God. As the verse asks rhetorically, for who is the one that has devoted his heart sufficiently to come close to me, says God, meaning who could allow God in, who worked hard enough that could be able to receive God's presence. The prophet Jeremiah laments that in the natural course of things, it's impossible to come really close to God. But that's only without the gift of non-dual wisdom, because God is too great. God can't come into me. But through the insight of Hasidic teachings, God will come so close to you that his address, actually becomes yours. So this brings you to an incredible state of joy. That even the prophet is saying, how could it be? And through this teaching of making a home for God, which means that meditation of God's non-dual existence, we're able to make a real home for God in our home, in our hearts. And that's why it was established that every morning we offer praise and thanksgiving to God's name. When we say, happy are we, and how good is our portion, how pleasant is our lot, and how beautiful is our heritage. That's part of our morning liturgy. In other words, just as a person would rejoice greatly if he were to inherit an immense fortune for which he didn't do any work, so too, and immeasurably more so, ought we to rejoice at the inheritance we have received from our ancestors, the truth of God's non-dual unity, that even in the earth below, there is no other besides him. So in addition to the joy of your awareness of God's presence in all things, you should also celebrate the fact that this secret came to you without you having earned it. If you had not learned about the non-dual reality, God would have remained distant from you. So thank him every day for your access to this wisdom and your soul's ability to appreciate it. It's your sacred inheritance. And that awareness of and devotion to God's non-dual reality is his home in the lower worlds. Let's just see a Hasidic thought, and then let's summarize this pretty enormous idea. It's one of the fundamental teachings of God's non-dual existence and how that fits in with me and how that could bring us to a state of joy. So let's see a Hasidic thought and summarize this idea. You take to heart that you are literally engulfed in God. It's on page 373 of the book. Everything around you and within you is nothing other than a divine indwelling, a ripple on the ocean of the divine. You are swimming in the wondrous reality of God. You're breathing God, seeing God, and dissolving in his presence. His warm, loving embrace is gently enveloping you to the point that you merge with him and come home to your sacred source. Such thoughts of extreme closeness to God, when contemplated deeply, are a great source of joy. Amazing. I think I'm going to take a picture of this Hasidic thought and just linger on it later in the day. And hold on one second. I just hear a child squealing. We have campers. I just have to make sure it's a laugh and a giggle and not a cry. Hold on one second. Okay, good. It's the source of happy children. It's always a relief. Okay, cool. It's an amazing, just this line. His warm, loving embrace is gently enveloping you to the point that you merge with him and come home. If you realize, it's a meditation, that everything in this world is all part of God's existence. There's nothing here that's separate from God. God is non-dual, which means everything in this existence is nullified and part of God. Just like the rays of the sun are nothing in front of the sun, even though they exist, but it's all part of the sun. You don't look at the sunlight in the sun and say, wow, the sunlight here is so beautiful. It's the sun that's so powerful. So our existence is all engulfed, and the existence of everything in the world is all part and included in God's existence. It's non-dual. When you recognize that, you realize how God is so part of me. When you allow God into you, and with that meditation, everything in the world, you see God's connection. You see God through everything. And therefore, as just the 2 points we said before, I found to be very powerful. It's available to you always, at any time, in any place, and affects your inner world. It's something inside of you that you're working through. And that's what it means to bring a home for God. In this chapter, at least, he's learning that how it's talking about in your microcosm. It's talking about in your existence, in your mindset, in your attitude. And I find that to be beautiful. That brings you to a great source of joy when you realize how close you are to God. Amazing. Okay, we're going to try to finish section 2, and that way we already made a good dent into the chapter. Section 2, faith, joy, and action. Below, which means later on in chapters 36 and 37, we will learn that God's home in the lower worlds is made through mitzvah observance. Meaning, how do we make a home for God? Later, we're going to learn this by doing a mitzvah. Yet here in chapter 33, the emphasis appears to be different. We are taught that God's home is made through conscious faith in the non-dual reality. So where is God's home to be found? In your faith or in your mitzvahs? And I think for those that are on our email list, I shared this in my email on Friday, how on just a few days ago, we took our daughter Hannah, who is, I think she's 9 months. So Adina wanted to get her ears pierced. And we went to, in the past, we went to Claire's, which is just like a local place. But Adina was researching, and her friends told her that it's more traumatic in Claire's. So we went to a proper piercing parlor, I guess, and a tattoo place. And it was quite amazing, where I'm talking to this young guy. His name is Sean. In my mind, like, I didn't even think of asking him if he's Jewish, which, I mean, I guess it's my job, but I just didn't enter my mind. And in the middle, he's saying, you know, in December, I went with my grandmother to a menorah lighting in Novato. And I said, oh my gosh, that was our menorah lighting. And it was for those that were there, it was a drive-in, which means everyone had to stay in their car. So I guess he didn't see me up front. He just heard me through the radio, but he was very excited that we made that connection. And it comes out that he's Jewish. And right then and there, right above the, it's my first time in one of these parlors, but right above where they do their work, we put on tefillin. And for me, that was the essence of making a home for God, that even in a place where you wouldn't think a mitzvah is really taking place, but it's happening right there. But that's how we're going to learn the idea of making a home for God in chapters 36. That's in the macro. That's in making God feel at home in the world. In places that you seem could be anti or antithesis, we're making that a home for God. But in chapter 33, the home for God is not something we're emphasizing in the broader world. We're talking about making a home for God in your mind, making your mindset home for God, welcoming to God, how realizing in your mind that God is non-dual, that everything in the world, yeah, sure, Zoom should make a spell check, should make an autocorrect for our Hebrew terms, right? Okay, so let's see that further inside. So the question that the Tanya we're trying to figure out now is, which one is it? Where is the true home for God? Is it in us, in our mindsets, or is it in the world, the broader world, which we're going to learn about in chapter 36? So the Tanya now clarifies that the two are intrinsically connected, two sides of the same coin, so to speak. And this explains the teaching of our sages of blessed memory. 613 mitzvahs were given to Israel. But Habakkuk, which was one of the prophets, came and hinged them on one. As the verse states, the tzaddik will be enlivened by his faith. In Hebrew, the term is the tzaddik Be'emunaso yichya. The tzaddik, which means the righteous one, will be enlivened by his faith. In other words, it's as if there was just one mitzvah, namely the mitzvah of faith in God alone, because it's through faith alone that you come to observe all 613 mitzvahs. It's an interesting debate in the halachic authorities, like Maimonides and other people, when they list out 613 mitzvahs of the Torah, there's a debate what the 613 mitzvahs are. There are certain mitzvahs that it's not debatable. We know there's a mitzvah to put on tefillin, like we were just talking about. There's a mitzvah to observe Shabbat. There's a mitzvah to fast on Yom Kippur. There's 613 mitzvahs. But there's one of them that is debatable if it's included in the 613 mitzvahs or if another one is. And that is the mitzvah of faith in God. Is faith in God one of the mitzvahs? Or is it the prerequisite to all the mitzvahs? So is it a mitzvah, or is it the foundation of all the mitzvahs? The Rambam, Maimonides, says that it's a mitzvah to believe in one God, the mitzvah of faith. That's the first of the mitzvahs. And we know that from the verse of the Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad. Right? It's to believe in one God, belief in one God. But there's other halachic authorities that don't list it out as a mitzvah because it's the fuel of all the mitzvahs, faith in God. And just interesting to note that from the early 80s, that the Rebbe started a cycle of studying Maimonides every day. And one of the tracks is to study one of the 613 mitzvahs. It takes literally a few minutes a day. And throughout the year, you actually study the entire Maimonides 613 mitzvahs. He goes through every one of the mitzvahs with details. And this cycle, we just started the 40th cycle of the Rambam. It starts literally yesterday and today. You could just hop right on. And you could go, there's even an amazing app that they created from Chabad.org. It's called just study, just type in Chabad Daily Study. There's a great app that you can do it on your phone. And there's also so many, go on Chabad.org Daily Study. There's an incredible amount of resources to guide you and to help you learn the mitzvahs of the day. And that way you could study in depth the mitzvahs, all the mitzvahs of the Torah. But anyway, back to the point here, there's a mitzvah of faith. And that mitzvah of faith, we're trying to say, is when you have the mitzvah of faith, you come to observe all the mitzvahs because you trust in God, you have faith in God, and then all the mitzvahs follow. So let's see how we're answering the question. We're just going to go back inside. When you're grounded, we're on the last line of the Kindle, when you're grounded in non-dual faith, mitzvah observance flows naturally from it. The mitzvahs are no longer perceived as a long list of commands issued to you from a higher authority. You feel God's presence powerfully and intimately, and that motivates you to connect to Him at every opportunity through mitzvah observance. Awesome. And a crucial ingredient for this flow from faith to observance is joy. Meaning that when your heart, hold on a second, let me just explain this for a second. Adina and I, we infuse our lives with chassidus, which means faith. We don't look at as a requirement in Judaism. We look at faith as the fuel for Judaism to exist, which means for my observance to flow naturally, for my performance to happen, it comes from faith. When I believe in God, I'm motivated to do mitzvahs. It doesn't seem like a chore anymore. So let's say Shabbat or kosher could be a chore, and it could be like an obligation where I'm scared of what's going to happen if I don't do it. Or it could be I am connected with the King of Kings. How could I not want to do this? It's almost like I'm so close to God. You have faith in God that is so intimate. You have a union with God that is so real, where God's so again, it's all part of the non-duality, where we don't look at God as separate, where there's God in the higher world and God's rays are shining here. God's infinite light is everywhere. And God is non-dual, which means everywhere is part of God. When I live with that message, everywhere I am, you have that faith in God. That observance is almost, I have an opportunity to connect here and there. It's not a chore or an obligation. It's a privilege and an opportunity. So that the main component here that we're getting to is then it's done with joy. And we're going to see how he's going to word it in the next paragraph. But I just want everyone to know when a boy or girl turn bar or bat mitzvah, one of the blessings we always give them that that the Rebbe would wish, and we repeat the same blessing, is that they should be a yiras shamayim. They should have an awe and a reverence of heaven, meaning they should feel a connection with God wherever they are. And when you have that, it's like, let's say in a relationship with a parent and a child, you could ask your kid to clean up after themselves and to do the dishes or to clean their room or to be more respectful. And it's almost like, okay, I'll do this. It's like a checklist. I have to do this and I have to do that also. It's much harder to get them to do each one. But if you focus more on a general theme of the love that exists between parent and child, and that bond that is unbreakable, and the trust that child has that my parent is there for my best and cares for my improvement every day and to develop me into a mensch, there's a lot more trust there, and the child reciprocates with that. So it's not just I have to do this and I have to do that, which I'm not saying it isn't. My kids are always telling me, no, I don't want to vacuum today, or whatever it is that their job is to do. It's a constant work in progress. But if you're able to tap into the deeper relationship, it doesn't seem like a chore when they're doing something. It's done with a light heart. It's done with a joy. And the same is also where we're trying to get to over here is when you focus on the faith, when you have that mentality, that meditation of the non-duality of God's existence, which is the theme of faith, then you're able to perform mitzvahs with an incredible sense of joy. And that component, that ingredient of joy, is the main essence of what this chapter is trying to get to. The joy in our relationship with God, the joy in our performance of mitzvahs. And it comes from this meditation. Let's see that inside. A crucial ingredient for this flow from faith to observance is joy, meaning that when your heart will find happiness and joy in your faith in God's non-dual oneness, as much happiness as can be, as if you had just this one mitzvah to observe, and this one mitzvah alone is the ultimate purpose for which you and all the worlds were created, then through the strength and energy that your soul will derive from this great happiness, your soul will be uplifted to overcome anything, preventing you internally or externally from observing all of the 613 mitzvahs. A mitzvah is faith concretized in action. So you have faith, but faith alone is not yet what the ultimate is. Faith leading to action, that's what a mitzvah is. When faith remains inside your mind and heart, it's more luminous and intense. In the mitzvah act, your faith is more manifest and contagious. Whenever you are feeling your faith or expressing it in action, you are making a home for God. Awesome. So you can have it's amazing. You can have the faith the way it remains in your heart. That's very intense. But when you act on it, which is what a mitzvah is, then it becomes contagious. You're making a home for God at that point. And this explains the verse cited by the Talmud as a source for this idea that the tzaddik will be enlivened by his faith. If you remember, we studied this from Habakkuk on the previous page. The precise use of the term will be enlivened points to the invigorating property of faith. Why is that pointing to that? Let's see the next line. Through this joy, your soul will be invigorated like the future revival of the dead, so to speak. So I'm not sure how to learn that from the verse of Habakkuk. Maybe let's see from the next paragraph. The Talmud itself doesn't specify joy as the crucial ingredient that leads from faith into action. But the Talmud does hint to the presence of some invigorating force with the words, the tzaddik will be enlivened by his faith. And that force, the Tanya suggests, is joy, a feeling of aliveness that propels us into action. So that's an interesting point. Let's just figure that out. So when Habakkuk, I'm just going to go back a page in case anyone wants to read it themselves. Interesting. Okay, so if I'm understanding correctly, and anyone could jump in if they have their way of understanding it, is the main component that we're trying to get to over here is the power of joy. That when we act on a mitzvah with the component of joy, that's truly when we're making a home for God. That enlivens us. So when the Habakkuk says that a tzaddik is enlivened by his faith, so we have the component of faith, which is the crucial foundation for our performance, for our observance of mitzvahs, that you can have faith the way it remains in your heart. But the goal over here is to take that meditation of faith, which is my mindset, and actually act on it. So when I believe in God as a non-dual existence, that nothing in the world is outside of God. Everything is part of God's essence, part of God's being, and everything is like nothing in front of God. That's non-duality. Just like the rays of the sun, in the sun, even though they're there, you don't consider them to be anything because you're in front of the sun. Yeah, you feel the power of the sun. So that's the power of faith. When I have that power of faith and I apply that in my performance of mitzvahs, the mitzvah is enlivened. It has the fuel of faith that is getting me to do the mitzvahs. So it doesn't seem like a chore. It's done with joy. It's done with a enlivenness, with what we say in Hebrew, l'chaim, to life. To life doesn't just mean to breathe. To life means do things with an invigoration. Do things with in Yiddish, the term over here would be a geschmack, with an enjoyment, with a feeling of, I don't know, how do you translate geschmack? Cheryl, do you know how to translate geschmack?
Enthusiasm. I'm studying in the.
Perfect. I love it. Great word. Awesome.
I'm studying that in the Musar.
Oh, good. Perfect. Thank you. So that's the beauty of that's when you make a home for God. When you have that meditation of faith that God is intimately connected and everything is part of God's being, and everything is God, everything is part of God. That leads you to do the mitzvahs in a way of joy, that I have an opportunity to connect. And everything in my life is connecting with God. So it's not done out of a chore or out of obligation. It's done with an enthusiasm and a joy. I mean,
Zerzut is the word.
Awesome. Zerzut.
Zerzut.
Perfect. Okay, so let's just finish with a practical lesson, and we will end with this. If you're looking in a book, it's going to be on 375. It's the sidebar, and this will conclude section 2 of chapter 33. God is at home in the universe when you contemplate his non-dual presence. The non-dual secret is your precious inheritance. Own it and celebrate it. There's a cycle. Contemplating your non-dual faith leads to joy, which then invigorates mitzvah observance. So you could fulfill a mitzvah, that's the end of the practical lesson, but you could fulfill a mitzvah out of chore, but if you could, or you could fulfill it out of joy. When you fulfill it out of joy, it's an entirely different experience. How do you get that joy in the mitzvah observance? That's propelled through the meditation in faith of God, which is God's non-dual existence. And that's a gift that me and you, each and every one of us, have as an inheritance. The mindset that we are born with, that God's existence is non-dual. And when we have that mindset of non-duality, it leads us to this strong sense of faith, which gets us to perform and practice a mitzvah observance without any, with a feeling of incredible joy. All right, we will end the class with that. Shalom, everyone. Thank you for another great week. I'm looking forward already to next week. God willing, I'll also give a summary and a theme of what the chapter, where we're going to be going next.
Thanks, Rabbi.
Have a great day. You are most welcome. Goodbye, everybody.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Tada.